Hello, welcome to Watercolor Techniques for beginners. When I start teaching watercolor to students, I just have them draw out some squares and they'll use these to put their watercolor techniques into. So here I'm just drawing out some nice large squares on a 140-pound watercolor paper. So let's start with a wash. A wash is when you are trying to make one space that is pretty even in color. This is a wet on wet technique, which means you're going to water it down first and then add your color second. What you're trying to do is make a nice even swath of color. Next, we'll do a wash wet on dry, which means don't add any water first. You're just gonna paint right on top of that dry paper with your brush. Again, try to make it nice and even. Next, we're doing blending. Blending is when you're just kind of popping a couple of colors in there and kind of letting them do what they want to do, kind of like a tie-dye. So I water my paper down first again, and then I can just add some other colors and play around with this and see what happens. Next, we have a dry brush. Dry brush is when you don't have a lot of paint on your brush or water on your brush, and you can kind of see the underneath part of your paper. A gradation means you're having a gradual change from one color to another. So this, I'm going from red, and I'm going to have a gradual change to my orange. So I want to lighten up as I go with my colors, and then start with my orange on the bottom and meet them in the middle, so you have a gradual change from red to orange. Blotting away is something you do maybe for your sky to create some clouds. You can use tissues with this, paper towel, sponges, whatever you have that will work to just take away some of the paint that you've put on the paper. Those look like nice clouds. Masking out. There's different ways to mask out. You can use painter's tape, and you can also use liquid masking. Liquid masking comes in lots of different brands, and you just paint it on first, and then you make sure you let that dry. It has to be dry before you do any of your painting on top. So once you draw on that masking, which I'm going to do here, I'm going to let it dry for 15 or 20 minutes before I do any painting over the top of it, or it just won't work well and I'll make a mess. Now that seems like it's dry, so I'm just going to take my watercolor and paint right over the top of it. And any place that I put the masking or the tape is just going to stay white. Now again, you need to make sure that the watercolor paint is completely dry before you try to take the masking off. So leave that watercolor for, again, 15 or 20 minutes or longer to make sure that it's really dry. Now mine is not quite dry, so I'm going to show you after I get this tape off of here. When I start to rub the masking off on the end, you can see that it doesn't work really well, and that is because the paint there is still a little dry. But all you have to do is rub with your finger that masking right off, or you can use a gum eraser, and that will take that right off too. Okay, just make sure that the watercolor is completely dry or it doesn't work. So now we're going to add salt for texture. When you add salt for texture, make sure that you've got enough water on the paper first, because the salt is going to dissolve in the water. And when that happens, it takes away a little bit of that pigment and it creates these beautiful little snowflakes. So you sprinkle the salt on there, and once it's completely dry, you can brush off any of the extra salt that didn't dissolve. Next, we're just going to do layers. When you do layers of color in watercolor, you need to let your first layer dry before you do the second, or it will run. So I'm going to let this first layer dry before I put my second layer on. Layering is really important in watercolor because when you're using more than one color, you're supposed to see a little of that other color underneath. And that is really important in watercolor. It's what makes it watercolor. So now I have two values. So I'm going to do some dripping. While your paint or your first layer is still wet, you can drip water on it and it will make kind of a little splash effect. It doesn't work as well with water as it does with rubbing alcohol. So rubbing alcohol will work a lot better for this. Sometimes if you're just using the water drops, it will still move and fill them back in. Color splatters. If you're doing color splatters, again, you want to water the paper down first with clean water. And then you'll notice when you put the little splatters on, they'll spread out in a kind of a star effect. Or you can gently just touch the very tip of your brush to the water, and it will also work that way and kind of start to spread out for you. Just gently tip it. There we go. A wax resist is done either with white crayon or oil pastel. I'm using oil pastel, and you just draw it on. Actually, you can use any color. And then you can just paint right over it. And that's a wax resist. Now we're going to use value. Value is, again, gradation, which is a gradual change from light to dark. When we're using value, it's going from light to dark with one color. So we're going to use these 4 spaces, and we're going to do layers to make value from light to dark, or gradation from light to dark. So I'll do my first layer, and then ideally you would let that dry before you put your second layer on. Or you can also water down the paints a little bit, or not so much, to add value. But I'm just adding layers. This time I'm only doing 3 squares, and that will darken them up. And then when I get to my layer 3, I'm going to do just the last 2 squares. And you can see that I'm starting to get that value from light to dark just by adding more each time. Then the last square. There you have it, value. Now we're going to use that value to take this two-dimensional circle and make it look like a form. We're going to make it look three-dimensional. And what we're doing is just using values like we just did, but going light to dark. Now when you're doing something that's curved or circular, you want to use brush strokes that are curved as well. That will help show that form's outer sides. So while I'm doing this circle or this sphere, I'm using curved lines, just like it would be curved on the outside of it. That will help my shape to look more curved. On the other end of it, if I was doing something that had straight sides, I would want to use straight lines when I'm shading in. Nice light to dark. It now looks a lot more three-dimensional. And I'll even add a little shadow here so it looks more three-dimensional. So those are your beginning techniques for watercolor. Make sure you go back if you need to, pause, and keep practicing. Thanks for watching.